If you have been around the channel, then you know just how strongly I feel about open access to information. I'm such a proponent of it. It is one of my favorite topics. And recently, the Trump administration has pretty blatantly been going against open access to information, actively deleting and removing research from government websites that was conducted through government funding. One of the huge issues when it comes to access to scientific information and scientific research is the barriers to actually getting those research documents. That not even when the research is actually done, being able to go and read those documents is extremely difficult. And one of the few examples of when it's a little bit easier is when that stuff is publicized by the government. And while for many people it's not really an obvious issue beyond the idea that, oh, the deletion and obstruction of information is inherently bad. It's book burning ideas, it's kind of those inherent ideas. I kind of wanted to talk about what the actual implications of this are for individuals and for legislation. A huge way that we can push towards legislation that keeps us safer is by having information about what is actually harming us. One of the obvious ones is going to be with things like pollutants. Throughout history, we have had various issues with pollution coming up. If you go all the way back to Industrial Revolution, you have when the rivers were literally catching on fire. Then in more recent history, you have things like the ozone being destroyed by hair products. And then now we see with climate change, with these new chemicals, with microplastics, all of these different things. We don't really know the full effect that those things even have on us right now. Any information that we do have is because of this kind of research. And any legislation that has been passed or is being pushed to be passed is because of this information that we have. You can't know that you need to push your legislator to help protect you against something if you don't know that it's harming you. And you're not going to know without this kind of research. Scientific research helps us keep our legislators accountable for protecting us. And I think something else that is scary, as someone who kind of does act when I can as an intermediary between these kind of obtuse, hard to understand forms of information and trying to condense them down for other people to understand, is that a lot of people won't really see the effects of this right away. That most people aren't reading these research articles, that they're getting that information secondhand once it's condensed down. But that it is still just as important to be vocally against and to push people to protect that information. Part of this whole campaign against information and research in science is coming through the attempted blocking of federal funding towards research. That has been protected thanks to the courts. Currently, the courts and the states are the most important part of fighting against what is happening. So far, all of the things that Trump has been trying to do have been blocked on the court level. That there was a federal judge who blocked the federal spending cut block thing, and that on the state level, attorney generals are going against these actions using the justice system. As we have basically lost faith in our Supreme Court, the focus is very much so shifting away from the federal courts and into the state courts and looking at each state. While it's obviously less than ideal because we would like to have the same protections regardless of where you live in this nation, that isn't the case right now. At the very least, on the state level, many of our rights are being much better protected. That there are states that are ensuring and continuing to ensure with their state courts abortion access and abortion care in protecting women's rights. The ACLU is currently partnering with other agencies and developing their own resources to start looking at the state level for how to protect and push civil rights movements as we are encountering issues with the Trump administration. It's also one of the issues why immigration is one of the scariest outlooks right now. Largely, the courts have a lot of power to stop what Trump is doing because it's largely unconstitutional. The only area where he actually has the power to be doing what he's doing is when it comes to immigration, as there's a lot less protections within the Constitution and within the state levels to deal with immigration issues. But for everything else, the states have a lot more power. Historically, a lot of change starts on the state level. Whether you look at the good or the bad, the states have been given agency. Another thing that's under fire right now are queer rights. And ultimately, to have gotten where we are right now, it started on the city level and then the state level before it became federally protected. And while those federal protections are looking kind of bleak, we can make sure that on the state level things are staying strong. One of the few benefits of things moving to the state courts is that it's much easier for individuals to actually go and look at things. It's hard to travel all the way to where the Supreme Court is, but your local state court is certainly closer, unless you're in a very specific radius of the Supreme Court. As scary and powerless as we feel watching this whirlwind happen around us, I think it's important that we don't fall into that trap. That there is a lot to be done, and that so far a lot of the scariest things are being stopped, being protected, and that there's work that we can do to continue that. In the last few weeks, as I've been doing research on what there is to be done to try and help with these things, I've been learning a lot. There are mutual aid or legal aid groups in your area that could certainly use your time or money in order to help. Legal aid groups are often a vital source of protections for civil rights. Many of us and many of the most vulnerable don't have access to lawyers to just throw money at and try and deal with cases, but these legal aid networks help to provide those resources when they otherwise wouldn't be available. There's also much that can be done to try and keep your state legislators accountable. I know that I have been extremely disappointed in the Democratic leaders that I elected. Coming from a swing state, we were all very proud to finally be making progress, only to see these people's names on bills that we do not agree with and that are antagonistic to us. I always kind of assumed, and this is coming from someone who's literally tried to make a platform and be somewhat politically involved, that a lot of lobbying efforts had to do with actual lobbyists, that you had to be part of those groups in order to have your voice be heard by your legislators. No. Many of those legal aid groups or the ACLU or these various groups can help inform you and prepare you to go and speak at your state legislators. While we have all heard about emailing and calling, it is much harder to ignore when people are actually at your doorstep. It's also a lot easier for the media to capture what you're saying. As scary and daunting as everything feels, I encourage people to look at these resources on the state levels, whether it be your state court or your state legislator, and that as these fights expand, that we go and support these efforts. If there is one thing that can be learned through online fan bases and online cancellations and online pushes and changes, is the power of mobilization and organized work. The right is so terrified of cancel culture because it works. That when people are organized, you can enact change. That is literally the idea that democracy is founded on. That if enough people organize to push to something, to vote for something, all of these different things, that real change can be enacted. And these online groups show that there are numbers behind them. It's just about actually mobilizing them. As scary and hopeless as all of this can feel, I am hopeful that more and more resources are being created overnight to try and address these issues. And while we can stave off the Trump administration for these 4 years, that if this energy continues, if we learn the tactics now to aggressively force people to listen to their constituents, that when the next 4 years come, rather than a kind of lull and dud that the Biden administration was, we can instead push to go further. Not just to back where we were before Trump, but somewhere better. Everything is really scary right now, but I hope that the fear captures enough people to do something, that not only do we never go back to this again, but that we get somewhere better.